Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's third meeting of 2020. Before we move to our first item in the agenda, can I remind everyone to either switch off their mobile phone, put them in silent, as they may affect the broadcasting system. Our members, agenda item 1, to ask members if they're content to consider agenda item 4 and all future consideration to the committee's approach to the climate change plan. We'll take that in private. Are you content with that? Thank you. We are content with that. And we'll move on to agenda item 2, which is to hear from officials from Marine Scotland on the Conservation of Salmon Scotland Amendment number 2 Regulations 2019. And I'm delighted to welcome our colleagues this morning from Marine Scotland. We've got Dr. Anya Branding, the Policy Team Leader, Keith Main, Policy Manager for Salmon and Recreational Fisheries in Marine Scotland, and Dr. John Armstrong, the Director of Freshwater Fisheries Laboratory in Marine Scotland Science. Welcome to you all. The briefing paper for this session sets out a number of themes and issues that we're going to explore with you. We've got about 30 minutes to do that, and members will recall that the committee took evidence on the previous regulations and had some ongoing concerns. I'd like to just open things up by asking you about what your engagement has been with the wider population on some of those, what that engagement has thrown up by way of concerns.
I'll start on that if I may. We have, over the last 2 or 3 years since I was in post, we've tried to expand our stakeholder engagement and our discussions with people about how we're taking forward these regulations. When they came in first in 2016, they came in quite quickly, and we've developed the modelling that we've done, and Dr. Armstrong will talk about that quite a bit. But the legislation requires us to undertake a public consultation on our proposals each year, and we've been trying to bring that forward and to expand it each year. So, for example, in July, for this set of regulations, in July of last year, we published our proposals on the Marine Scotland website with very detailed background information on the scientific model and on the proposals for the river gradings. We are required and did publish that in the 3 main newspapers in Scotland over a couple of weeks' time. In July, we have a mailing list of something over 1,500 people who have over the years expressed an interest in Atlantic salmon and wild fisheries. We mail out to them to direct them to the consultation. We've also this year tried to engage better on the Marine Scotland Twitter account. And on our own website, colleagues at the Marine Lab have done quite a nice little explanatory video of why we do the conservation assessment in the way that we do. I think that's generally welcomed. Interestingly, the response in the 4 weeks to that consultation, we had 39 responses, formal responses, which is exactly the same number as we had the previous year. They covered a range of issues about asking about the model, wanting more information. There are people who believe that we should be going further or taking a different approach. 1 or 2 questions about specific issues. Colleagues in the team have engaged with every one of those 39 respondents. Sometimes it was just a matter of pointing them towards additional information. Sometimes there's been ongoing correspondence. We've had telephone meetings and 1 or 2 face-to-face meetings, but it's part of throughout the year, we engage with the District Salmon Fishery Boards, with Fisheries Management Scotland and other organisations to try and keep improving the knowledge amongst our stakeholders of how we do the model and what the actual results mean on an ongoing basis.
We'll pass on to Claudia Beamish to pick up on some of the concerns that we're aware of. Yep.
Right, thank you, Ravina. Good morning to you all. Those of you who were there in the last session of the Parliament will recall that there were far more MSPs around this table asking questions on behalf of constituents and fisheries boards and trusts. I'm interested to know, in your view, all or any of you, whether you think that the whole situation has sort of settled down and whether that's because of more understanding through your own work and through concerns about conservation of salmon as an iconic species and a protected species, or whether it's for other reasons that has happened, that there isn't so much interaction about it.
I think it's fair to say we have a lot of interaction throughout the year, and it doesn't always just happen at this public consultation part for the regulations. But people generally, I think, have accepted or are accepting the need that we have to really take some quite difficult steps to conserve salmon in the longer term. That isn't always popular on an individual angler by angler basis or river by river basis, to be honest. But I think it's fair to say that for every response that we get from people who say, I don't think my river should be a grade 3 river, which is where catch and release is mandatory, we will also get some river boards coming to us and saying, actually, you're allowing catch and release, but we think we have to do more to conserve the stocks. Can you not move the model and make us a grade 3? It very much depends on, to a certain extent, it depends on the area of Scotland that we're dealing with, the other rivers in the locality, the management interventions the district salmon fishery boards and trusts are taking. There's still a wide range of views on how we model and how the regulations come out, but I think there is a better understanding that we're taking a long-term approach. And I think there's a better understanding also that Scotland is taking an approach which others are looking at. So, for example, south of the border, we're very engaged with the administrations in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, talking about how we do it and learning from each other. And people are beginning to understand that too, I think.
Could I ask you very specifically about if you could give us an update on the arrangements for the half netters in the Solway, and I don't think there are any netting stations that are active on the East Coast at different places anymore, but I may be wrong on that.
And not half netting.
No.
There are some netting stations in river for other types of netting. Right. The Solway half netters, I wasn't around in 2016, but I know that we started a 3-year project with half netters on the Solway in 2016 through to 2018, which allowed a certain number of salmon to be caught and retained under licence, and we worked very closely with them to take samples, and some of the study results are available, etc. Longer term, the half netters in the estuary are working in what we term a mixed stock fishery, which is to say that they are catching fish at a point where we're not sure which rivers they're going to go to. And on the Solway, some of the rivers which feed the Solway estuary are grade 1 rivers, grade 2 rivers, grade 3 rivers. And in those circumstances, not just for the half netters, but for other parts of Scotland, we've said that if there's a mixed stock fishery, then we cannot allow fishing in the estuary or the Firth. Sorry, that's wrong. We can allow fishing. What we can't allow is we can't allow the retention of salmon. So the half netting community on the Solway are able to fish. They're able to catch and release Atlantic salmon, and they're able to catch and retain sea trout, should they catch them. But at the moment, because of the way in which we grade the rivers, and because of the grading of some of the rivers in that estuary, they are not able to retain
Right, so could I just check very quickly, and I'm sure we could have further conversations about this if appropriate. It's been highlighted to me that scientifically the suggestion is that there's less mortality from that process than there is from the dangers of catch and release, because the hook doesn't go into the salmon's mouth, basically, and therefore, is it not possible that the half netters could keep more fish, or fish? Is that something you've looked into?
There's no need to press the button. It's all done for you.
We haven't looked into that, but I can see the logic of that. There wouldn't necessarily be a need to take the fish out of the water, which is one of the key issues. But anglers typically only catch in the order of 10% of fish moving upstream. And now, even of that 10%, they're releasing 90% in that order. So there's very little damage from catch and release in angling, just by those numbers. In terms of where we have rivers that are in poor conservation status, we really just don't want fish killed, I'm afraid.
Appreciate if you could just look into that issue and perhaps get back to the committee. Thanks.
Finlay.
Thanks. Good morning. In the past, we've seen a lot more response from rivers and whatever, and I think a lot of that was because there wasn't a huge amount of confidence in the science that was used to grade the rivers. And I know there's no change in assessment methodology, but it would appear that more people are accepting the river grades that are being brought forward, because I believe everybody wants to preserve salmon, and they really want to look at the science. But can you tell us about the ongoing work that's going to develop, the model that you're developing, and how is that going to give even more confidence to the managers of rivers that the grading has been carried out right? And how are you using juvenile assessments as part of that model?
Yes. I think there's more understanding about the limits of the available data. One can only work with the data that are available, and actually to collect more data is very expensive and time-consuming. So it's a question of developing models that can use information that can easily be or readily be obtained. So I think that's made a difference, that we've perhaps communicated that more effectively. We are at the moment, as requested by this committee, publishing data on the adult model. We've published a paper on fecundity that is now available. We're working on 2 other papers, and those should be brought to a conclusion within the 3-year period where we've agreed just to hold things steady. I think we will make some further developments. We're working at the moment with folks in Wales to look at an improved method for stock assessment, which will improve, again, the model to some extent. Then, in the meantime, we have been developing the juvenile assessment approach. So all of that modelling work has been published now, so that is clearly available. And I think we've consulted widely on that. And I think generally people understand how that can feed into the process. And certainly in terms of the trusts and the boards that we've talked to, they're content with that. We've had 1 year now of electrofishing in the National Electrofishing Programme for Scotland. So those data are in, and and have been analysed. The second year, the data are in, and they're currently being analysed. So that will give us 2 years of data that we will look at. And I think the next step in that process is to look at how the 2 different models, the adult model and the juvenile model, can be brought together into an assessment method. And I think it will be very important to consult on that, because both modelling approaches have their strengths and weaknesses. How we actually bring them together, because they're done on rather different scales. The adult model is on a river-by-river scale, which again is what, as committee, we've moved towards. The juvenile modelling is on a regional basis, so it doesn't give the same precision, and we'll have to take these factors into account as we come up with a new assessment approach that brings the 2 models in. So I think that's the way we'd see things moving forwards. So overall, I'm pleased with progress. I think it's on the sort of timescale that we'd anticipated, and I think there'll be a lot of activity this year to see how we can bring those models together.
Thank you. Previously, we heard about the importance of fish counters and how there was a lack of fish counters, but also they're expensive to install. Is there any plans to roll out any more fish counters? And is your budget looking at salmon conservation going up or going down? Do we need more money to make sure that we get the best science?
We are further developing a fish counter strategy. Again, we will be consulting with local fisheries biologists next week at their annual meeting on the latest work there. We have last year started work on a fish counter on the River Aire, which is important. Strategically, it's in an area of the country where we really need more information. We've taken the opportunity there while civil works were being done on a weir to put a counter in. So that's been really quite an economical effort. At the same time, we're working with the Esks Fisheries Board on the East Coast, looking at a counter for the South Esk. And that's a project that's in progress. And actually, we've spent quite a lot of time repairing our own counters, which also obviously is a demand on resources. In terms of budgets, it is an important issue going forwards. At the moment, we have the same individuals, if you like, either moving between various projects that are occurring in parallel. And I think there is a growing understanding and sense of urgency in terms of managing salmon. And certainly it's a good time to look at whether a budget uplift is possible. And I think the salmon strategy that I think Ange will come on to talk about will obviously include some of the thinking around budgeting going forwards.
Mark, you wanted to ask a quick question.
Yeah, I was just wondering how climate change feeds into these models, particularly the wetted area, if you have drought conditions and particular water levels or water temperature, how that might affect the predicted egg count.
No, that's a very important issue. Warming of upland areas, particularly in Scotland, actually, is really serious now. Salmon operate best at temperatures in the teens, around 16. Once you get up into the high 20s, you're starting to have serious problems. But with the temperatures we're seeing now in Scotland, we're already into areas that can cause problems for salmon. So at the moment, we're working with juvenile models at a given temperature. And I think as things change going forwards, if we continue with warming, then we would need to continue to look at those models and recalibrate. But what we're hoping is we have some plans that we could move forwards to increase river shading, which hopefully will give us opportunities to ameliorate some of these temperatures. I think we're in quite an unusual situation with climate change with salmon, in that we can actually act and we can make a difference. So if we can shade rivers, we can start to bring those temperatures into areas that are good for salmon, not just salmon, for other animals within the ecosystems within rivers.
Come back to Finlay.
Yeah, just very briefly, the controversial topic of restocking rivers. Are you doing any work to look at what the impact of restocking, or there's some rivers that will take wild salmon and they'll take the eggs and restock using fish that came from that river. Are you doing any work to look at the impact of restocking?
We've done quite a lot of work over years. For example, we know that if you rear wild salmon to a smolt stage and then release those fish, which seems a sensible way of avoiding limitations on growing fish within the river, we know that only about 1/10 as many fish come back as would do if they were reared properly as wild fish. They simply don't develop properly. In terms of juveniles, the key work we've done is to really refine our understanding so that we can avoid damaging populations by negatively affecting the local gene pools. And I think if we look back with what we know now, quite a lot of stocking that's happened in the past simply would not have been sensible.
I'm going to bring in Angus MacDonald.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Just quickly going back to the issue of shading of rivers, are there grants available for, or is there a possibility of grants being available for riparian schemes?
At present, the grant schemes don't cover riparian potential in Scotland. And I think this is a key area where a bit of activity could make a big difference.
That's something that you will look at, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Rachel.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just confirm that no significant changes to the assessment and methodology will be made until 2021? Is that correct?
It's 21.
That would be the plan. Currently, we said what we would do is freeze this year and next year. So the modelling that we do for the next round would actually be for the 2022 fishing season. Because of the time it takes to get the data in. So what we're working on is the 2018 data to inform the 2019 assessment for the 2020 fishing season. Effectively what we're doing is we'll have one more year of freezing the model, which allows us to do the work and the assessment to bring things together. That's what we had said a year ago to the committee and to other stakeholders that we would do. It allows us some space to develop the models. It also allows stakeholders some space and some certainty to allow them to manage their fisheries. And before, I think I'm right in saying, John, before we do anything else radical to the model, our intention would be certainly to take that to you know, boards and trusts and to consult on what the next steps would be.
It's reassuring to hear that. But are you confident that the current categorisation decisions without the data that you're aspiring to can be confidently made?
I think we have the best assessment available at the moment. The methodology hasn't changed, but the data does change. So we are using the most up-to-date data that we have from the Fish Counter network that we do have, and from the catch returns from angling clubs and individual anglers, etc. So we are in the best position we can be at the moment with the knowledge that we're hoping to develop further moving forward. We have, I think, this is the 5th set of conservation regulations, and I think we've moved a long way in those 5 years, actually, in terms of expanding the model to cover individual rivers as opposed to districts, which is what the first set of regulations were. We've added more rivers. We've improved our knowledge of the fisheries. We've improved our engagement. We've increased the number of the percentage of catch returns that we have feeding into the system. So there's more that can be done, but I think we have a good sound model at the moment.
Could you also expand on the impact of predation? There's obviously been some work done around the stomach gut, the pisciferous bird stomach analysis project, which has resulted in SNH issuing 4 licenses. How is that project coming along, and what impact has predation had?
It's progressing well. It should be reported on by CEH probably in May, or certainly not too far into this year. The aim of the project is, in the 1990s, there was a large assessment of stomach contents of birds across Scotland. And this part of the project is to see whether the results will be substantially different from that earlier time period. The reason being that fish communities have changed in the intervening time. There are far fewer eels, for example, than there used to be. So it might be that birds are eating more salmonids instead now than they used to. So that's why there's that component of the work. But the other work that is of considerable interest at the moment is there's been a number of projects tracking smolts moving downstream with little acoustic transmitters. And some of these projects have suggested that losses are really very substantial, maybe in the order of 50% losses of smolts. At the moment, we don't know how much that is due to predation and how much is maybe due to the methods that are being used. But we will be starting, not this smolt run coming up in 2020, but in 2021, we're funding a project that will look in more detail at those smolt losses using the smallest possible tags, and also absolutely minimizing any impacts of catching the fish, which might make them vulnerable to predation. So that project will help us refine those estimates. And the next step will be to try and find out which predators, if indeed it's predators, and well, a lot of it will be, are consuming those smolts. Interestingly, if one could actually increase smolt survival by 50%. Obviously, one couldn't have that full 50%. But that would actually counteract the 50% decline in return rates that we've experienced since the 70s. So what it illustrates is that if we can find ways of reducing predation, we can have a very significant benefit towards the overall survival of salmon. So it's an area we're particularly interested in.
Another point, just last question, convener. You said there could be other ways of reducing predation. Currently, of course, the way is for an SNH to issue a licence. What are the other ways? And do you believe, as we move forward and there is evidence of specific predation, we might see an increase in the number of licences issued? And how would that have how would that have an impact on public perception, for example?
So it's a very good question. There are ways that one can reduce predation. For example, we're very interested also at the moment in looking for improved seal scarers that will actually just keep seals out of rivers and therefore just stop the overlap between the vulnerable prey and the predators. Looking at for pinch points where smolts are particularly vulnerable to birds, and intensifying scaring in those areas might be one approach where one could have a non-lethal reduction in bird predation levels. But going forwards, probably there are some difficult decisions to be made, because if animals like Atlantic salmon are dying on the high seas and we want to keep numbers up, then we have a limited number of ways to do that.
Move on to questions from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks. I think last year, when you came to committee, we were talking about the potential socioeconomic impacts of regrading rivers down the way. And you mentioned that Scottish Enterprise were doing a study into that. So wondering, is that study concluded? What are the main conclusions of that?
Scottish Enterprise did a study through the course of last year. It wasn't a Scottish Government study, it wasn't a Marine Scotland study. It was done at the request initially, I understand, of, I'll get this wrong, Tweed, Tay, Dee and Spey. I think they were the four rivers who worked with Scottish Enterprise to look at a number of aspects. One of them was economic impacts of the downturn in fisheries generally. You know, the impact on rural economies and the wider Scottish economy. The second part of the study was looking at opportunities that fisheries could look at to, for example, provide more of an experience with fishing. So it's not just about the traditional turn up for a week and cast your fly into the water and go away again on Saturday afternoon. It was about more what an area has to offer, what Scotland has to offer. In terms of the economic impacts, the study was quite a high-level initial study, actually, and as many of these studies do, says there's a lot more work to be done. What it did say is that there are all sorts of complex issues giving rise to a downturn, for example, in angling club membership, or you know, long-term, the old-fashioned week-long booking of fisheries doesn't happen so much. To some extent, I guess that's about the gradings of the rivers. The report, as I saw it, didn't really focus on that a great deal. But we do understand that people come to us and they say, you know, we're concerned that our river is a grade 3 because some people still want to catch fish. In actual fact, 93% of all rod-caught salmon in Scotland in 2018 were returned to the river as a matter of course anyway, whether the river was a grade 1, 2 or 3. The vast majority of anglers understand the need to conserve salmon, which is great. We also understand that people are more mobile nowadays. So, for example, they're not taking a full week's fishery. They may take a day ticket or a couple of day tickets somewhere and move on. People can get up in the morning and over their breakfast they can come online and say, well, I'm going to go fishing today. I wonder what the water levels are like on such and such a river. They can get bang up to the minute information about fish flows, etc. And if they don't like it there, they can check another river. So people do move around. There are lots of different experiences and lots of different reasons for the impacts that come out. It was interesting in the report as well as saying that areas which are already offering that sort of experience day or week to people are not seeing such an impact on the local economy as some of the traditional fisheries at the moment. And so there are lessons, I think, to be learned. But as I say, it wasn't a Scottish Government report. I think at the moment, the fisheries themselves, the rivers, the District Salmon Fishery Boards and the River Tweed Commission are looking at the results of that. And I'm sure that other fisheries will be looking at that. But it's striking that balance, and I think the reports get that too. It's striking that balance between the need to conserve the fish and the need to be aware of the impacts on the angling clubs, the fisheries, and the wider economy as well. It's a difficult balance to strike.
Okay.
Ron, I'm just looking at Claudia. You might have wanted to ask something on this particular.
Follow up.
Carry on.
That's helpful and reassuring what you've explained, Keith. But it has been highlighted to us in our briefing that there are some angling clubs and individuals who still have a concern in relation to not being able to kill salmon. That some clubs have said, as if I understand it correctly, that has caused a dip in their membership. Is that something that you're able to or have indeed asked that question of clubs? Because I'm not quite sure where that information came from, and there's obviously still further education to do if that's out there still.
Individual clubs or club secretaries, and particularly as part of the stakeholder engagement for these regulations, who will write to us and say they are concerned if they're in a second, third, fourth year of a grade 3, that they see a falling membership. I understand that. I don't think that the grading is the sole reason for that. There is a long-term downward trend in many areas away from angling club membership, for example. As there is in other areas of life, people don't necessarily sign up for a single river and a single club all year because people travel more and they will fish on day tickets here and there. We try to respond to that as well as we can, but we have an overriding need to make sure that we can conserve salmon for the long term, and that includes for the long term future of anglers and fishing in Scotland. And we do our best to apply the model that we have and the results that we have consistently and fairly across Scotland. I understand that means that some rivers, some of the smaller rivers and some of the smaller clubs are feeling feeling the pinch. I'm not sure that it's all about our gradings. There are big reasons for it as well.
Right, thank you.
Okay, move on to looking at the Atlantic Salmon Strategy. Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener. As you know, the Scottish Government's latest programme for government stated that it's committed to developing a national wild Atlantic salmon strategy by September this year. So can you tell us what progress has been made on that?
Thank you. The fact that the salmon strategy was part of the programme for government commitments reflect that protection and enhancement of salmon is indeed a priority for Scotland. So our formal stakeholder involvement to develop the strategy will start very soon. So in that respect, I don't want to preempt any of the discussions with the stakeholder engagement. But what I can say here is just to give you a broad overview to the approach. The strategy will be based around the 12 high-level pressure groups which have been identified together with stakeholders last year. And they will be looking to address those. It is likely that the strategy will take an outcome-based approach, which is in line also with the National Performance Framework. So any actions identified will always be in relation to specific outcomes. But what is quite clear from the discussions also that we have here today is that we're not starting from zero. We have a wide range of ongoing projects and initiatives which are partly already bearing fruit. So I just wanted to say just very briefly that there are, apart from the conservation regs and the underlying scientific evidence that we are gathering to support that, there are also initiatives, for example, as part of the Predator Management Group, where the Scottish Government and other stakeholders come together to look indeed into the issues of predation, which is quite an important aspect. We also liaising with scientists, regulators and local biologists and managers over the potential for nutrient additions and oligotrophic regions to support salmon populations. We're providing funding of about 5 million annually towards a large program of work to increase salmon access to upstream and downstream river habitat through the Water Environment Fund. And we have also developed the Scottish River Monitoring Network, which provides a tool to help prioritise tree planting along rivers, to actually identify where the greatest mitigation effect to keep river temperatures down can be had. So the recent roundtable event, which took place here in this room on the 7th of January, was also an opportunity to hear more about the pressures that salmon populations face and the impact also that it has more widely. It is quite clear that research and evidence will play a very important part in the strategy, as research and evidence can point us not only to the problems, but it can also help us to identify solutions. So I said the formal engagement with stakeholders in Scotland will start soon, but also to say that the next North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Annual Meeting will take place in Scotland, in Edinburgh, in June this year. And that is reflecting the fact that, of course, this is a wider issue, not just a Scottish issue. The issues of salmon decline actually pertain throughout the North Atlantic. So it is quite important that we engage with our international partners to share good practice. And to some extent also, it will be an opportunity to showcase what in Scotland we are doing to protect salmon and engage with our partners. So just to sum up, the strategy will aim to draw together in an accessible format all the strands of work that we are undertaking. It will try to identify new areas and set out our priorities going forward. Quite importantly, the issue of fish counters, for example, was brought up, and there is an opportunity through coming together with stakeholders through the strategy to actually prioritize areas where we invest in fish counters, for example, and how much we would deploy there, because it is clear that we would need to be careful how we prioritize this work. It is also clear that quite a wide range of policy areas and stakeholders will need to work together to deliver actions to support wild salmon. This won't be a Marine Scotland salmon strategy. It will be a Scottish salmon strategy which will draw out how a wide range of parties will need to come together to protect and enhance Scottish salmon populations.
Okay, thanks. The event that you speak about that's due to come up in Glasgow, there was a similar event in Iceland last week that Sir Jim Ratcliffe held, given that he's a major landowner up there. Did Marine Scotland send anyone to that seminar?
No, I'm not aware of that. Okay. I'm aware of that meeting that was convened, yes.
Yeah, I was just curious, thanks.
No.
Okay, I think, well, we have actually gone 10 minutes over time. It's a very quick question, Rachel.
To a supplemental to Mark's question about the socio-economic impact, the Scottish Enterprise 3-month study, when will that conclude and when will it be available? When will they publish that report? Do you know?
I don't know. I mean, we have seen a very late draft. I was under the impression it was published, but to be honest, if I put my hand on my heart, I couldn't point you to it. We can find out, but it's certainly, as I say, it's not a Marine Scotland report. It's a Scottish Enterprise report commissioned by the Four Rivers. So I'm not quite sure where they are on comments on that.
I haven't got time to ask you this just now, but I mean, it's something to consider, that the impact that consultation will have on your decision making as well.
Thank you. Right, I want to thank our three colleagues for coming in today. We're going to suspend briefly to allow our witnesses to leave. Okay, next item on the agenda today is to consider the following negative instruments. First one is the Conservation of Salmon Scotland Amendment number 2 regulations, and the second one is the Electricity Works Environmental Impact Assessment Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019. Do any members have any points they want to raise in relation to these? Claudia.
Thanks, Kavina. Just very briefly, I think it's heartening that the science appears to be more granular for the salmon gradings, and while there are still concerns, and it is an iconic species and protected species, the wild salmon as we know, it seems that we're in a better place than we were a few years ago, even though maybe not in terms of the whole North Atlantic issue.
Okay. Any other points in relation to the First
I feel
Amendment?
slightly uncomfortable about it because I don't feel confident about the socio-economic impact that it will have, although I completely understand the science and the conservation aspect. So I think there's a real balance to be had here, and my nervousness comes from not having everything available in terms of data or the projected new methodology that we will see after the moratorium is finished. And I wonder, in a way, Convener, whether the moratorium, perhaps we might see it being extended at the time.
Okay, your points are noted. In relation to, is it on the first, the salmon?
I mean, I was quite reassured by the evidence and the lack of concern this year coming from stakeholders. I mean, this is a protected species. We should be, restoring its status in Scotland. I'm particularly interested, maybe going forward, what sits around these regulations. So, in particular, the investment in riparian planting, some of the wider ecological work that can be done to restore the status of the species. And I was heartened also to hear about the economic impact study, which seemed to show that there are wider issues at play here. It's not just about the status of the salmon; it's about the changing nature of the angling industry and the offering that it gives, and the licenses that are available on a daily or weekly basis. So I'm content with the regulations that are in front of us.
Yeah, thanks. I think we now have more confidence in the river gradings than we had in the past. They still seem to be very up and down, but certainly it would appear that they're far more on a scientific basis. I think we need to look at the two different issues we have: the scientific information about preserving the salmon, which is vital, but we also need to look very carefully at the impact of the regulations on the economy and the impact that river grading might have. It's a separate thing, but we maybe need to look at how the government can support angling clubs and rivers going forward, because if we do have a gap and a drop in anglers, we may not have the fishermen there in the future, and that's really important. So we look forward to the Scottish Enterprise report, and that might need to be another piece of work that we do.
Yep, or something we want to flag up to our Economy Committee colleagues as well. Yeah. Any comments on the Electricity Works Environmental Impact Assessment, Mark?
Just briefly, Convener, it might be useful just perhaps to write back to the Scottish Government just to get a bit of clarity over multi-stage consent processes. I would certainly find that useful. I mean, we're talking here in these regulations about the Electricity Act consent processes, Section 36, Section 37, but it'd be useful to know what kind of multi-stage consent processes are used across the planning and consent system, because this can be quite complicated, and it'd be good just to get some clarity over that.
I write to the Scottish Government to get clarity on that. Any other points you want to make or comments? No? Is the committee agreed it doesn't want to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments? Agreed. Thank you for that. That concludes the committee's business in public today. Its next meeting on the 4th of February 2020. The committee will hear from Scottish Government officials on the proposed regulations to establish a register of persons holding a controlled interest in land. We'll now move into private session and ask that the gallery be cleared, as the public part of this meeting is now closed.